All right, Jeff, we're ready.
So Michelle High, Senior Editor of American Purpose, thank you so much for organizing us and admitting folks into the Zoom room, Michelle. And I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. I have been looking forward to this conversation all week, in fact, all summer. Tip of hat, and thanks to Michael Jindra, who is somewhere here. There he is. Hi, Michael, who writes for us, and you can find him on the masthead. I've known about Vittorio's work and read it for some years, but I didn't know him. And Michael made the introduction late spring, early summer. So Michael, thank you very much. And Vittorio, thank you for making time. The brief introduction, but you have been introduced in invitations for this meeting, is that you are an Italian-born German philosopher, I believe, born in Milan. You're an academic, an essayist, and since around 1999 have taught here in the United States at the University of Notre Dame with concurrent appointments in philosophy and political science and German studies. And the point of today's conversation is the following. I read something that Vittorio wrote recently, candidly recently, for the first time and now twice. It's in German language, so bear with us on that. But Michelle will put a link into chat for those of you who are able to access it. The piece, the essay, you all comes from 2015, so seven and a half years ago, and it's about Russia. Vittorio has background experience. He's traveled and spent time in Russia, and he advanced. Now you have to imagine 2015. He advanced an argument. I won't do justice. I'm doing it in bullet form, but here goes. He advanced an argument that Vladimir Putin is using energy as a weapon. It's a powerful weapon, and German political elites are unaware or inattentive. He advances the idea that Vladimir Putin time and again outplays his opponents because he understands their short-sightedness. And he gets it each and every time, and we fail to each and every time. The third thing is that Vladimir Putin, as a former KGB man, has, and I'm paraphrasing, perfected the lie, and that he is far, far, far more skillful than any of us really understand and appreciate. And then the last thing that I found so interesting in 2015 was a point that Vittorio makes, that 2015, remember the date, that Vladimir Putin has undertaken his first incursion in Ukraine, as if there's another one to come. His first incursion into Ukraine, and Putin feels, unlike China, that he's racing a clock for a variety of reasons, and conceivably this makes him even more dangerous in the short term, and as you say at the top of the essay, Vittorio, more dangerous perhaps than the Soviet Union in the 1970s. It's a provocative thesis. It rings so true on many fronts 6, 7, 8 years later. So the piece is in chat. Vittorio is with us. Vittorio, tell us a little bit, if I may start, about your relationship to the subject matter Russia, why you came to write this essay in 2015, and how it rings to your ears today, 7 or 8 years later.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss with many friends. I see Michael and Ines Jindra. I see also Avi Zataka, who spoke once at Notre Dame. So I'm very glad to have the occasion to speak here. I came to know Russia relatively well in 1990. It was the time of perestroika and glasnost, and the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Philosophy of Russian Academy of Sciences, Soviet Academy of Sciences, of course, at that time, invited scholars from abroad to come to Moscow. Derrida was there for some time, and I was invited for 4 months. In these 4 months, I was able to perfectionize my Russian. I had begun to read Russian long before, but I was able to converse with people in Russian, read with dictionary, also complex works. I read several works of Lenin while in Moscow. I read the first volume of War and Peace, and the original takes time, but with dictionary, I can read everything. And since then, I kept a lot of relationships to Russian friends, scholars, and was observing what's going on. And I have not returned to Russia for a long time, but through the constant information exchange with Russians, I was more or less aware of what was going on. And in fact, for me, the alarm clock began to ring already in 2013. So before the invasion of the Crimea. It had, of course, in a certain sense, already begun with the invasion of Abkhazia, which is part of Georgia, in 2008. But in 2013, a Russian friend sent me a speech, not secret speech, it was readable on the internet, but you have to know Russian in order to understand it, which the then Vice Prime Minister of Russia, Rogozin, wrote. And this speech was an outbreak of hatred in which fundamentally he said, it's enough, we have waited enough. All the weaklings that do not understand that the time is running away. We have now to implement the aim to restore the Soviet Union. That was the Vice Prime Minister of Russia in 2013, so before the invasion of the Crimea. And when the invasion of the Crimea started, I began to look in detail at the Russian media and at the Russian details, and to have a lot of conversations, particularly with my great friend Maxim Kantor, whom I consider one of the greatest living artists, and also novelists. He's a Russian painter, of course. He has lived for many, many years in exile, who explained to me what was going on. And by the way, this connected back to some things that I had for the first time witnessed in the summer of 1990. After my 4 months in the Soviet Union, I was invited on what was called a mission. It was a cruise in the Black Sea and in the Eastern Mediterranean with a lot of Russian intellectuals, also members of the highest Soviet, the Soviet parliament, but also of the parliaments of the various republics, Armenian scholars, etc. And it was full of KGB agent, obviously. It was still under the Soviet Union. But even if it was so, I remember one day I went into the main room on the ship, and we were unveiling big photographs of the imperial family. And you saw the veneration, and people said, this was our great past. And while speaking, while we were surrounded by KGB agents, I met people. I understood they had to belong to Pamyat, which was this extremely right-wingish organization that was more or less let loose under the late Soviet Union. They could do what they wanted, to explain to me that the Soviet revolution had been done by Jews and Freemasons, and that now we have to go back to the true Russian values, etc. At that time, these were not the mainstream voices, but they became stronger and stronger in the 1990s because the expansion of liberalism under Yeltsin proved lethal to a lot of people. Retirees lost all their pensions. The social inequalities were horrific, like in Brazil, in a country that had cherished for many decades communist ideals. I remember when I was in '93 in Moscow, shortly before the deposition, according to the constitution of Yeltsin, and the use of tanks against the Russian parliament, that at that time was in the White House. Now it's the Russian government that is in the White House. I remember I spoke with some very interesting Russian intellectuals, and they asked me, you in the West, whom do you support? The president or the parliament? You always tell us that you're on the side of the parliament, but it seems that you're clearly supporting Yeltsin, and if he will be legally deposed according to the constitution, you will support him. Is this your understanding of democracy? Now, the situation was extremely complex because nobody wanted Rutskoy, the vice president, who became president after the deposition of Yeltsin. But what certainly the West taught Yeltsin was that the West would accept if the government maintained itself by force. And since the end of the Soviet Union, we have had no choice of government, no change of government in the Soviet Union. Of course, Yeltsin appointed Putin. In this sense, there has been a transition of power, but he had handpicked him. He had chosen him. The rochade between Medvedev and Yeltsin fulfilled only the necessities that at that time the constitution imposed on Putin had not real effect with regard to power distribution. So we have had in Russia since its independence at the end of 1991 continuously one a government that could not be exchanged. And at the same time, we have had a narrative that was building up already in the 90s. We have been deceived by the West. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragic error. In fact, Yeltsin was impeached in 98 because of his decisive contribution to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but the impeachment was not successful. It's extraordinarily difficult to make it successful according to the Russian constitution. And what we had more and more was the formation of a government with all power, elimination fundamentally of a vertical division of power insofar as the members of the federation were more or less were losing their independence. The governors were appointed by the Kremlin, pushing back of the authority of the constitutional court, and at the same time a strong build-up of the military, beginning in 2007 with Serdyukov, who was the Secretary of Defense. In 2007, he was extremely effective and very good. He was then overthrown to a large amount. He was very hated by the officers because he had reduced the number of officers in a very reasonable way. The ratio officers soldiers was far too high before. And since then, we have had Sergei Shoigu as Secretary of Defense, a person who openly says that one of the persons he admires most is Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. Those of you who do not know Soviet history well, let me tell you, he was of all the pathological brutes during the Civil War, the most pathological. By the way, not a rat. He was close to the white, but he fought also against the white. He thought of himself as a reincarnation of Genghis Khan and behaved accordingly. I once read in one of the web pages of a youth organization of Russian parties that they suggested to celebrate the birthday of Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, the 29th of December, every year to honor Shoigu, the Secretary of Defense. Given the fact that Roman von Ungern-Sternberg killed all the Jews that he could get in their hands, including women and children, it would be comparable if, for example, a German party organization would suggest to celebrate the birthday of Heinrich Himmler to honor the current Secretary of Defense. All these things were strange, to say it kindly. And the strange thing was that, at least in Europe, most people looked away. They didn't want to discuss it. And as Jeff was saying, they became more and more dependent on energy imports from Russia, even if in 1998, Alexander Dugin, whose daughter was murdered a few days ago, obviously the attempt was directed also at his life, but he escaped because he changed the car before. Dugin in 98 in the Osnovi Geopolitiki, the foundations of geopolitics, explicitly said that we have a geopolitical project to bring Eurasia, at least Northern Eurasia, under the control of Russia. And to do that, we need three ways. First, make the West, Europe, depend on our energy resources, already explained, with the explicit end of achieving a Eurasian empire in 98. Relentlessly use Russian propaganda, and then, when it becomes necessary, to use force. So what, for me, is most irritating about the whole story is that all this was laid out like Hitler's ideas you can read in Mein Kampf. You have to read the book. It's not a very agreeable reading, but if you are in politics, you have a damn duty to try to inform yourself what are the political ideologies driving the main actors. And this was, in my eyes, neglected by the West.
So, Vittorio, thank you very much. I have, in my notes just now, a number of follow-on questions, but we keep these conversations fairly tight, small-ish in number, and we keep everybody on schedule. So we've got 30 minutes for Q&A from the gallery. And I'm looking at the gallery. Michelle, has anybody used the raised hand function? While I'm waiting, Peter?
Fritz Heitzen. Fritz just raised his hand.
So Fritz and then Peter.
Vittorio, it's good to meet you. We've never met in person. We've met indirectly with Nanovic, various Nanovic events. I work with them on the Shannon Prize and such. So it's good to meet you directly in this sense. And normally I always forget to give my biography. We're always supposed to introduce ourselves, and I've never remembered to do it, but I'll only mention it this time because I think you'll appreciate the sort of largesse of Notre Dame that you've seen while there. And I was an undergrad there in the 70s, and I came back. I taught at Notre Dame in the 80s, and I had the best appointment at Notre Dame at the time. I taught in 5 departments. My course, was for government, theology, philosophy, sociology, and economics. I had 4 TAs. Each department had to provide a TA. I had a budget that was so big, I never was able to spend it, and I got to live on campus. So I was a great benefactor of Notre Dame, and I know you've been and have brought so much to Notre Dame. The other thing I must do because I'll be in trouble with my daughter if I don't. My daughter says hi. You probably won't remember her. She was never a student of yours, but she was always brought into anything that was German language related, language department related. She was brought in. And so she was so excited today, but unfortunately there was no opportunity for her to be here. So she said, I hope this is recorded. And she said, you must say hi from Katie, and we'll leave it at that. Let's get to the question.
Thank you very much. Also back to her.
It really, there's so many great stories. There's so many great stories that she had, or Clements, of course, our colleague Clements has about, or a specter of philosophy. That term I've been very amused at as how he uses that with you. But to the question, and it's this: I've read many of your writings on Ukraine or interviews with newspapers and so on, and a question that no one seems to ever ask, and I'd like to ask it of you. And I'm going to use a term that is very controversial, and I actually don't like when applied to German history for various reasons. And Hedwig Richter has, of course, got the debate going with her new book, Demokratie. But it's this: Russia has aggressively had that Red Army running around Europe, or Russian army, for over 100 years. It's been attacking everybody. It's a threat. It's now a terrible threat. So the term Sonderweg, is there some unique problem with Russia? Do we have to mention Sonderweg as we do with German history? Do we have to discuss this with Russia? What is it with Russia that it has been a problem now for so long?
Well, that's a very good question. And I'm afraid that one has to answer yes, Russia is quite different from the rest of Europe. Look, when I was a gymnasium a visitor in Germany, like you must have been, because you're probably born in Germany. Am I right to assume that?
Actually, I was born in the US. We're from Cologne, but I was born here.
You were already born in the US, yeah. Well, I was born in Germany, and our teachers who taught us history always said, look, the main purpose of this class is that you understand how to avoid what has happened between 1933 and 45 in Germany. First of all, it was horrific. But second, if Germany would embark a second time in that direction, nobody would ever accept the Germans as part of a family of nations again. And the fact is that the Russians now, for the 3rd time, show that they are not able to develop a democracy, which is okay in my eyes. If they are not able, they are not able. But they are also unable to avoid imperialist gestures. Imperialism was very, very important in the 19th century, even if the Pan-Slavists, particularly Danilevsky, claimed that the big difference between Russia and the West was that the West was aggressive. And of course, he pointed correctly to the colonies of France and Britain, where Russia did not have colonies. But Russia in 1870s annexed large parts of Central Asia in the 1870s. So of course, it was an imperial power, even if it didn't have to cross ocean to get its backland. Clearly, Stalin was an extraordinarily imperialistic politician. He expanded at the beginning in the agreement with Hitler to Finland and successfully to the Baltics, to Poland. What we now see is that for the third time, the Russian government tries to expand its territory. So I'm afraid that this is deeply ingrained. And if you ask, where does it come from? It's difficult to say. Some people have argued, for example, the eminent East Europe Russia historian Pipes, whom Michael Jindra quoted recently in an essay, that a lot of the Russian national character had to do with the expansion of the Mongolians. In the 13th century, Russia is overrun by the Mongolians, and that on the one hand, the Russians were victims. On the other hand, you find in poems by Alexander Bloch already the idea that the will of the Mongolians has entered us Russians. So we have also internalized some of the Mongolian ideas. And so I do think that this imperialist mentality, we are there to dominate other nations, to conquer them, has been a relatively constant part of a national character of the Russians. Of course, there are also great forces against it. I mentioned only Tolstoy, who was certainly one of the greatest minds in Russia. And I don't like at all the idea that now we should cancel Russian culture. Nothing more stupid than that. We have to appeal to the great intellectual and moral resources of the great Russian writers to try to bring people back to moral principles. But the fact that the Russians don't manage democracy and that they have difficulties to accept the current borders, I do think is probably something that has been there for a long time. In this sense, you may call it a national character as long as this term does not entail that it cannot be changed. The Germans, after all, changed quite a lot after 1945.
Thank you.
So thank you, Fritz, and thank you, Vittorio. Peter, did you have your hand up? Peter Scary? You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I would welcome the chance to ask the question of Professor Hösle, whom I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, but enjoyed his presentation. And unfortunately, have not read very much of him either, but I would be very interested to hear what his views on what kinds of policies he would argue that the United States or the West should pursue vis-a-vis Russia in this critical era. That's my question.
Yeah, that is $1 million question, Peter. Thank you for asking it. And the answer is, of course, not easy. I personally think that in the whole, we have behaved correctly in the sense that given the enormous risk of a war between the United States and Russia, worst case scenario with involvement of China on Russian side, which would doom the project of humankind, most probably, it is wise that no European country, no NATO member has entered the war. On the other hand, it is also absolutely crucial that we help Ukraine to ward off the attack. We cannot let this happen. Not only because it's wrong to allow a bigger state to swallow a smaller state. Fundamentally, this has not happened since Iraq occupied Kuwait in 1991, and in Europe it has not happened since Hitler's attacks against Soviet Union's attacks against Poland in 1939, and then the German attack against the Soviet Union in 1941. So this cannot be accepted, but also for a prudential reason. If Putin had succeeded in occupying the Ukraine, first of all, he would have maltreated the Ukrainian population in a terrible way. We have all read the document published in RIA, so in the official Russian news agency, what to do with Ukraine, and we have seen what the lot is that expects them. But the young people would have been transformed into cannon fodder for the Russian army. Russia is around 140 million, Ukraine more than 40 million. That would be a considerable addition to this nation and to its armies if Ukraine would be subjected to Russia. And there is no doubt that Russia would not stop there. Clearly, if Kiev had fallen, as Putin had hoped early, the Russians would already be in Georgia and in the Moldavian Republic, and I think they would prepare everything to invade the Baltics. This way, in any case, then the West would have to enter the war because of the duties of alliance. And so it is very important to prevent this war by trying to prevent Putin to be successful in Ukraine. And I think we do the right thing. We have had a relatively strong regime of economic sanctions, stronger than anything else we have had in history before. It doesn't go as far yet as it should, but at least it was imposed quickly. We have a strong armament of Ukraine and an education of Ukrainian soldiers. Also, this, in my eyes, has not only to be upheld, to be increased. My great fear is, of course, that Putin waits for the winter when it will become quite cold in Europe, and that he presumes that then we will hear more and more voices of appeasement in Germany. Let's make a deal with the Russians. That is what he hopes for. Whether this will happen or not, I don't know. Obviously, I hope not, but you never know. I, at the same time, regarding policies, do think that it is very important to try to find some agreement with China. Because again, the worst possible scenario is, of course, China coming in on the side of Russia. It's also possible that the Chinese hope that there will be a big war between the West and Russia, and they can keep in the back and then at the end be the laughing third, picking up what remains of the world and subjecting them to that. But I personally think the Chinese are more rational than the Russians. They are not driven by imperialistic desires in any way comparable to the Russians. Clearly, they want to have Taiwan back, but here the situation is notoriously complex because according to international law, Taiwan is part of China. This has been recognized by most countries, so it cannot be treated in the same way as the invasion of Ukraine from a point of view of international law. And in the whole, I do think it must be the Chinese should be brought into a strategy to contain Russia by explaining to China, who has benefited enormously from globalization, unlike Russia, that they have so much to lose if globalization collapses, and even more if we have a nuclear war. So that would be fundamentally the strategies that I would pursue. What I do not think is very realistic, even if there are a lot of people in Europe who hope this, is that Yeltsin will replace soon. I don't see that at all coming. Let's not forget that Putin, like Hitler, has been extraordinarily intelligent in building up absolute power and eliminating potential adversaries. He also has an own Praetorian Guard, the so-called Rosguardia, which is not foreseen in the Russian constitution, which was founded only during his presidency. Do you know how many people are in this Praetorian Guard that obeys directly the president, so it bypasses the chain of command, unlike the armed forces, it goes directly to the president. Do you know how many people are in the Rosguardia? When I ask people, well, they say, well, if the main task is to protect the president, 10,000. No, it's almost 400,000. They've pervaded all the forces, the armed forces, the secret services. All this constitutes the Rosguardia, and the head is Viktor Zolotov, who was the judo sparring partner of and teacher of Putin, who is regarded as an absolute loyalist. So I think that, unfortunately, Putin is very well protected, and it's not likely that he will overthrow, even if some people have naive hopes that this will happen.
So thank you, Peter, and thank you, Vittorio. I'm waiting for hands, and I'm going to ask the next question. 15 minutes to run now. Vittorio, say a little bit more about Germany. And you said the forces of appeasement. There is, of course, in Berlin, a fairly robust pro-Russia, pro-Putin network in politics, also in industry in the country. They've been quiet the last 6 months, but they are still there. And then also I note for you to respond and expand that Germany is likely to face some economic pressure this winter. Recession, colder apartments, bigger heating bills. I noted yesterday that the German railway system has announced that they will prioritize coal and oil. and passengers should be prepared for disruptions in passenger travel. So there are all sorts of things, a confluence of events that in my view, may make Germany a troublesome partner this fall and this winter. Could you speak to any of that?
Yeah, Jerry, unfortunately, your fears are completely, Jeff, Jordy's are completely justified. We don't know what will happen in the winter. My analysis is the following, that the Social Democrats are more likely to give in to Russian allures. Let's not forget that the Eurasian ideology, which is very powerful in Moscow, always considered Germany an important ally. Therefore, Russia wants somehow to go back to the time of a Stalin-Hitler pact. And I think, Jeffrey, that they will try to do it. And within the Social Democratic Party, there's a relatively strong faction that wants to have business as normal with Russia. Just today, a group of social democratic leaders belonging to the left of the social democracy, both in the federal and the state parliaments, signed a letter in which they said we have to come quickly to a peace. As if it were so easy to come to a peace. Does it mean that we should allow Putin to solidify his criminal gains so that he can build up more the army and then in the second step to attack anew? Why should we trust him if he says he wouldn't do it after he has broken all the promises so often? So I find it very naive, but it's there. And the persons in whom I have more trust, Jeffrey, with regard to the maintenance of a tough stance against Russia, are the Green, which is in many aspects paradoxical, since the Green Party was founded in the late 1970s and early 80s to a large amount as a pacifist party. But you find some of the strongest supporters of a tough stance against Russia within the Green Party. For example, our Secretary of State, Annalena Baerbock, but also Anton Hofreiter is a very strong anti-Russian green person. So in principle, it is also possible that the government will fall in the winter, that the Greens and the Social Democrats will not agree on the way how one should continue to deal with Russia. It's possible. Then there are two possibilities. Either you form a new government without new elections, and the only government with the majorities that could be formed would be a government between Christian Democrats, Green, and Liberals, or you have anticipated elections. So I don't know what will happen. I simply, it's difficult to predict, also because our Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, is not exactly very clear in his assertions. It's difficult to read his mind. His answers usually are evasive. He has, of course, to maintain peace within a relatively split party, but you also have the impression that he himself is quite at a loss. What would he do? And let's not forget that this is a serious problem when we are facing the perspective of war. Obviously, the Russians are much, much better prepared for war than, let's say, the Germans would be. The Ukrainians showed that they were much better prepared than the Russians had anticipated, because since the annexation of the Crimea, they have practiced a lot with American help. They've been trained on excellent weapon systems, etc. But the Germans have not gone to war for fundamentally since 1945. Occasionally we were present in Afghanistan, some small numbers, but there is no real military know-how. But not less important is that the politicians have no experience with war. That's different from Britain, where Britain had a stronger, how should I say, maintenance of belligerence. Also France intervened several times in Africa. So neither our military nor our politicians are very experienced with war. They lack the know-how necessary in order to succeed. And this makes Germany certainly a problematic ally, particularly since it is the economically by far most powerful member of the European Union.
So thank you very much. I have Chris, and then I have Avi, who put something in chat, who's welcome to have the floor. Chris, can we call on you, please, if you have your hand up?
Hi, thank you. Hi, Professor Bosley. Very, very interesting presentation. So I have two questions. I'm going to try to make it quick. They're kind of different. So first of all, I mean, the title of the meeting is Russia more dangerous than China? I just want to point out the relationship and see if you concur that since the early 2000s, if you read the the publication from Pentagon and our intelligence agencies, we were going to make a full pivot in terms of our military defense investments into Asia Pacific and pivot away from Europe, right? And it started at the end of the term of George Bush. It actually continues through both the Obama and Trump presidency. But with this particular occurrence, it really benefits China in that way that if they're able to keep the United States financially and militarily engaged pretty intensively in the European arena. So the more they can indirectly keep us there, I would say that will actually make them a little more dangerous. But as a power player behind the screen versus out in front, right? And the second question I have a little bit different is that obviously what happened to Russia is a vacuum of ideology, right? They for the longest time they were ruled by czars, and then the communists replaced it, and the religion as well, and now it's kind of ruled by personality, through Putin. And this marriage was a very, very strong the Orthodox Church, which is very, very well married with the state. Based on your experience time there and your dialogue with your friends, do you see any opportunity the Orthodox Church can play a role in become more independent and serve as a, I won't say moral background, but just as an alternative to the state, especially given Putin is over 70 and he's not going to be around forever. Where do you see the future of Russia in terms of ideology? Thank you.
So Chris, thank you. And Vittorio, before you reply, and as I'm watching the clock with about 6 minutes to go, Professor Tucker, did you want to join the conversation? If so, this would be the time.
Well, just about the topic of removing Putin and the dim prospects for it. I think what Vittorio mentioned about this parallel structure with 400,000 people, sort of a recreation of the KGB, that's very important, because to remove a leader in a totalitarian state, there has to be an organization that will be able not to be penetrated, so that they're not arrested before they actually do something. And that's, I think that's the main problem, is there a possibility for any kind of independent organization to exist in today's Russia? And I'm fairly pessimistic about that. And then the scenarios really are the end of Stalin. Only when he's physically dead, whenever that happens, then his minions will have to quarrel and kill each other and get to some kind of power distribution afterwards. Right now, I don't see that happening.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to agree with what Avizia was saying. I don't think there is another solution to the, how shall I say, loss of power for Putin when his death. And it will probably be a natural death. It may be even the case of Stalin, as you know, when he got his stroke, his closest friends did not call the doctor. So they let him die, but they did not cause the stroke. The stroke was caused by Mother Nature, and they had to wait for that moment. So let me try to answer the two questions. Since I completely agree with Avizia Tucker, I want to concentrate on the questions of Chris. The questions of relation of Russia and China and the question of ideology. With regard to the question of Russia and China, Chris, you're right that the topic of the talk was a little bit different. By the way, I had not chosen it myself. It was Jeff who had pointed in that direction. I myself know Russian decently. I don't know Chinese at all. I spent only 1 month in China teaching at Fudan University, so my knowledge is much more superficial. But you are, of course, completely right that the Chinese people don't like the pivot to China politics, and that they're happy if America is distracted to the Atlantic theater, because they understand that Europe alone is not able to ward off Russia. So it's clearly in the Chinese interest. I myself am more pro-Chinese than many Americans are, in the sense that I would strongly insist that we distinguish between the Chinese type of government and the Russian type of government, even if, of course, in the last decades, Xi has maintained a form, has built up a form of rule that goes beyond the traditional forms of oligarchic check and balance that China had. Since Mao Zedong, nobody has had as much power as Xi. But still, it is so that, first of all, the Chinese government seems to be much more committed to the welfare of the own people than the Russian government is. Look at the life expectancy of Chinese and Russian people. The Chinese have 5 years more life expectancy than the Russians. Of course, there is also corruption in China, but it doesn't have a complete shameless nature and impunity that we have in Russia. And furthermore, China does not have an agenda of revanchism. Taiwan is the main problem, but they do not have the feeling we have been humiliated by the other nations and have to take our revenge. That is deeply, deeply rooted in the Russian soul, and it's not very different from how the Germans felt in the 1920s. We have been maltreated, now we need our revenge. I don't see this coming in China. The Chinese are much, much better business people than the Russians. This means that they are more rational and amenable to economic rationality than the Russians are. Therefore, I think you can come to a deal with them in the sense of policies of the 18th century, where the various European powers had only smaller cabinet wars, but tried to more or less negotiate conflicts. I see a possibility of negotiating with China if we do not pretend and presume that we can tell them which form of government they must have. I do not think that the majority of the Chinese people wants to have democracy, and therefore I do not think it's a good idea to try to sell it to them. Now, going back to Russia, you asked the ideological situation. The ideological situation is, of course, a very crucial aspect in order to understand the behavior of a nation. And when the Soviet communism collapsed, there was a complete vacuum. Liberalism came over only as the ideology of people who wanted to enrich themselves quickly. There was no moral basis to that. And the Russian Orthodox Church never accepted liberalism. It was very different, for example, from Germany, where the classical liberalism of the 19th century was deeply rooted in cultural Protestantism. There was nothing like that in Russia. Is there any hope that the Russian Orthodox Church will move away from its unholy alliance with the government? I'm not sure, also because there is, of course, a long tradition of Syropathism in the Byzantine Church already, which Russia inherited. Peter the Great, whom as we know, Putin venerates, introduced the Holy Synod, which was a state organ and eliminated the independency of the Russian Orthodox Church. One positive aspect is that Ilarion, the former Secretary of State of the Russian Orthodox Church, has criticized the war very heavily, the highest hierarch who spoke up against the war, and therefore he was deprived of his position and was sent to an absolutely minor position to Hungary. Metropolitan Ilarion is a person whom perhaps you could find some interlocutor for a policy that is not based on aggression. On the other hand, Ilarion himself is absolutely anti-Western. I know from the archbishops, I'm myself a member of the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences of the Holy See, so I speak regularly with bishops and cardinals, that they considered him even more anti-Western than Patriarch Kirill. But at least he has spoken out with remarkable courage against the war. Let me finish, since the time is on. When I was on this cruise in 1990, I remember like today, when suddenly a person with a very earnest face came to me and said, "They have murdered men." Alexander Men was one of the great Russian Orthodox theologians who in the 1980s had also a lot of followers who tried to argue that the Orthodox Church should accept liberalism and should reform itself. And he was murdered. Until today, we don't know who murdered him. But that was, in my eyes, one of a tragic moment in the history of the ideological evolution of Russia, because if man had remained a loud voice, he might now have led the Russian Orthodox Church to another direction.
So with that, dear colleagues, it's a wrap. I want to thank everybody for making time to join this and participating. Vittorio, that was stimulating. We're going to keep reading you and following your work. Thanks for making time today. Your semester is already underway and you're back from travel. Thank you very much for that. And then you all, if you're in a position to do so, and your camera is off, feel very invited right now to switch your camera on for a moment. We have people in different parts of the United States. We have people in different parts of Europe, just to say hi and bye and good afternoon, evening to everybody. Frankfurt Yama, thank you, and Michael Allen and everybody else. Thank you all, and then more again soon. Appreciate it. Vittorio, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Should I leave now, yeah?
Yes. Bye-bye. Thank you.